All right, here we are once again, Friday morning. What about this verse? Um, this one doesn't start necessarily with a verse. We're going to start with something I hear all the time, and it gets pretty well. Let me go ahead and turn this up so I don't have to look at who's watching or who's not watching. There's something we hear in the church a lot, and it is this: God will never give me more than I can handle. Um, I hear that people, when people say this, they're usually going through something horrible and they're feeling deep in their heart they're not able to handle this. And so they say, I know that God's never going to give me more than I can handle. And so, and with all of that thought, there's this feeling in them that they've got to be strong, and they've got something within them and within their nature where they can actually withstand and get through this, and that God will be sensitive to whether or not whatever they can do. You know what? Let's say it again. God will never give us more than we can handle. Well, I have a question. Who told you that? Who who told you that? Or what's better than who told you that is, can you give me the scriptures that tell us that God will never give us more than we can handle? Um, And the place where people have led me, even pastors, I've had pastors say, "Oh no, it's in the Bible." Well, let me read to you 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13. No temptation has seized you. Oh, wait a minute. I'm doing it in the NIV. I'll read the New King James. No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. But God is faithful. He will not allow you to be on what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. Okay, this verse by itself doesn't say anything about difficulty in our lives, and that God is not going to give us more difficulty than we can take. That's not what this says at all. This verse has everything to do with temptation to sin. Look at the verse on your own, look at the context of it. And even the next verse after 1 Corinthians 10:13, the next verse is, so flee from idolatry. So what this is talking about is no temptation has overtaken you except what is common to man. What that means is that, look, you and I are often tempted to sin. And we don't want to sin. We don't want to miss that mark. We don't want to harm ourselves. We don't want to harm anybody else. We want to live a holy life. Um, and so we have to realize, though, that there's going to be temptation to do something stupid. But whatever temptation you and I are dealing with, uh, just understand that nobody is more tempted than anybody else. Whatever temptation you're dealing with today, it's not unique. Sorry, but it's not. Somebody else is dealing with it too. And so we've all dealt with all the same temptations. And so your temptation is not unique. But as it says, God is faithful. And he's not going to allow temptation beyond what you're able to bear. And so what this means is, for every temptation, there's going to be a way of escape. That where you're never going to be cornered by temptation to where you have to sin. You you will always have a way to just run away from it. God will never allow you or me to be cornered by the temptation to sin. So do not use this verse to say what you want it to say, in that God is never going to allow us to go through difficulty. Or should I say, God's never going to allow us to experience a difficulty that we're not able to handle. So, back to our subject, though. Now that we've seen what 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13 means, um, let's talk about this. God's not going to give you more than you can handle. Practically speaking, if God won't allow or won't give you more than you can handle, then what happened to all those people who died? I think they got more than they could handle. They got way more than they could handle. Um, and what about those things in your life that when you come across the difficulty, obviously you didn't die. You're listening to me right now, but you didn't die, but you handled it poorly. People who run to drugs, alcohol, or whatever so that they could get away from their problems or so that they could handle a problem. These, they got more than they could handle. So the question is, what does the Bible say about our ability to handle difficulty? Um, Well, first of all, you see throughout the scriptures is when God delivered the children of Israel out of Egypt and he's going to bring them into the promised land. The promised land is full of giants, full of, very fierce people, more numerous than the Israelites. And God even told them, these people are bigger than you. You can't do this. God says, I'm going to do this. And how often throughout the Old Testament when they'd be up against an army that was bigger than them, and God would have to tell them, like 2 Chronicles chapter 20, where God would finally say, as he said to Jehoshaphat that day, he said, look, the battle is mine because you can't do this. There's a purpose in all of this, and let me tell you what it is. Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 8 and 9, for we do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, of our trouble, which came to us in Asia, that we were burdened beyond measure, above strength, so that we despaired even of life. Yes, we had the sentence of death in ourselves, that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead. God is teaching us to trust him because he's the only one that's going to get us through this and into glory. And there's always a purpose in difficulty that is beyond us. So God does give us more than we can handle, but certainly, you may have heard this, and this is true, he doesn't ever give us anything more than he can handle. He's the one that's got to handle it. We are weak. We are, and I'll tell you what, we're weak, but there's going to come a time in our lives where we're going to have to accept that. Because when I was 20, you could not convince me I was weak. Maybe weak in character, maybe weak emotionally, mentally. But hey, I can do anything. But now the older I get, it's like, oh man, I'm weak. I can't handle this. So I think that extreme difficulty helps us to understand that we are frail, that we are needy, and as even Paul said in 2 Corinthians here, we have the sentence of death in ourselves. Our difficulty reminds us that we have an expiration date. And there's no innate strength in us that's going to prevent that. There's no strength in you that's going to prevent your expiration. So, and actually, the most horrible and the most blessed times can all be wrapped up into one event sometimes in our difficulty. And that is like complete loss of hope. I've been there a few times. And I knew I couldn't handle it. And that was my prayer. Look, I can't do this. But when there's nothing left of us, that's when we can finally see God. That's when we understand more who he is, what he can do, what he has planned, and that he is working his glory in you. Through the difficulty, through your willingness to finally just give up and say, I can't do this, Lord. I need you. That's it. And it's not just a mindset, but in this surrender to him, that surrender also brings you to a point where you'll go ahead and obey him. Say, look, I'm going to do this your way, even though your way doesn't seem to make sense to me. As I said, God is making some beautiful things out of you. And pain, difficulty, and at times loss of hope, because, man, sometimes you get in such a way where you're talking to God about it, saying, now look, I understand that you want to use me. I understand that you got a plan for me, but this can't be it because it ain't working. But it is working. God is working the glory in you. So anyway, hey, take the weight off of you. Stop trying to be so strong. Be weak. It's, man, I tell you what, it's liberating. You know, when I don't have to take the pressure of having to be strong, having to stand up, but instead I can go ahead and sit in a corner and quiver if I want to. But in doing so, it's when I finally confess and surrender. Okay, God, you're the boss. You run this. You're the only one who can. So it is true. God will give you things or allow things that you can't handle so that he can, and you'll know him better. So I thank you for hanging with me today. I hope you got something out of this. So see you later.